Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Shalom. I'm David Mencer, Israeli government spokesman. Today is day 222 of the October 7th war. 222 days on, our war aims remain precisely the same: to bring home our 132 remaining hostages still brutally imprisoned by Hamas in their terror dungeons, to destroy Hamas politically and militarily, and to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel. I will start today with an update on casualties. IDF fatalities since the start of the October 7th massacre have unfortunately risen to 621. Sergeant Ira Yair Gispan was just 19 years old from Petah Tikva. He fell in battle in southern Gaza. He was a young man adored by his family and friends and his teachers. As the Prime Minister said just yesterday at the torchlighting ceremony on Israel's 76th Independence Day, and I quote, "Our best fighters have fallen in heroic battles. The bereaved families suffer the terrible anguish of loss. The wounded are coping with the injuries of battle with incomparable dignity. I embrace everyone with love. I wish a speedy recovery to the wounded. When I meet many of them and with the families of the fallen, they say, our heroes did not die in vain. They were not wounded in vain. Do not stop until the Hamas monsters are eradicated. And I promise that is what we will do. May their memories be a blessing forever." I want to give you an update on progress of IDF's work to defeat Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza. Yesterday, further proof of the terror involvement of Hamas within UNRWA was exposed. Armed terrorists shooting from within an UNRWA compound alongside UN vehicles. Now, we made this video available. It's freely available on the IDF website. It's as clear as day, actually. We ask this simple question: what were the terrorists doing inside an UNRWA logistics compound and alongside UN vehicles? This was UNRWA's logistic warehouse in eastern Rafah. It's a central point for UNRWA's aid distribution in Gaza. Terrorists are seen armed inside the compound alongside UN vehicles and shooting civilians right outside. The UN must answer this question. Now to inside Rafah, where 4 Hamas terror battalions remain. The IDF are operating in specific areas of eastern Rafah. Israel will always operate strictly in accordance with international law, carefully, methodically, and in stages, with temporary evacuations of civilians away from the fighting and towards safe areas with shelter, with food, with water, with access to medical care. Our efforts to prevent harm to uninvolved people go on. Despite this, Hamas have repeatedly rocketed humanitarian safe routes and cynically used civilians as human shields. For the IDF, it's yielding results. Since the beginning of the operation in Rafah, our forces have eliminated approximately 100 terrorists. IDF targeted a Hamas training compound. IDF eliminated terrorists in close quarters combat and located large amounts of weapons and equipment. In the last 24 hours alone, the Air Force has struck and eliminated 80 terror military compounds, weapons storage, missile launches, and observations posts. In central Gaza, our forces this morning completed an extensive operation in the Zaytun area. Around 150 terrorists were eliminated there. In addition, I want to share with you details of a central Hamas war room that was embedded inside an UNRWA school this time. Yes, embedded inside an UNRWA school. In the school were 15 terrorists, some of whom were involved in planning and carrying out the October 7th massacre. We precisely struck the room. They are no more. In Jabalia, in northern Gaza, an overnight operation hit terror operatives and infrastructure. These were intense battles. Around 80 terrorists were eliminated. A cell which fired towards Sderot yesterday was also eliminated. Now to northern Israel on our border with Lebanon. Last night, our aircraft located and identified senior Southern Front Hezbollah field commander, the terrorist named Hussein Ibrahim Meki. He was in Tyre, southern Lebanon. Meki had many terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians under his belt since the start of this war. He previously served as the commander of Hezbollah's force in the coastal region. He was identified, he was targeted, and he was eliminated. Reports have stated that more than 30 Hezbollah commanders have been killed in strikes in southern Lebanon in the past 7 months. Now on to COGAT, which coordinates the entry of aid into Gaza. Israel maintains its effort to get more essential aid into Gaza under strict supervision intended to prevent the transfer of equipment and food and resources to terrorist elements. Since the beginning of the war, 28,000 trucks delivering over 530,000 tons of humanitarian aid have entered Gaza. These are the facts. More food and aid enter the Gaza Strip every day, 80% more food compared to what was imported into Gaza before the October 7th massacre. The humanitarian aid arrives at the Gaza Strip by sea, by air, and by land. So that's the end of our briefing today. I will now happily take your questions, which you should put in the chat with your news outlet. Thank you very much. First question, please.
First question, what is Israel's response to the UN calling for the recognition of a Palestinian state?
Thank you for that question. Just this afternoon, the Prime Minister rejected the UN General Assembly vote on resolution on May 10th. The Prime Minister said, and I quote, "We will not give a reward for the terrible massacre of October 7th. We will not allow them to establish a terrorist state from which they can attack us even more strongly." Now, in Israel's national unity government, this has been voted on, and it has received unanimous, that's unanimous to a person, approval for the Prime Minister's proposal to postpone the adoption of this resolution. The Prime Minister also said, and I quote, "Today the government opposed the UN decision from last week to promote recognition of a Palestinian state. No reward will be given to the terrible massacre of October 7th, which 80% of the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, support. We will not allow them to establish a terrorist state from which they can attack us even more. No one will prevent us, Israel, from exercising our basic right to defend ourselves, not the UN General Assembly and not any other entity. We will stand together with our heads held high to defend our country." Now, as part of this postponement, the government determined 3 things. Firstly, to reject the decision of the United Nations General Assembly of May 10th, 2024, to upgrade the status of the Palestinian Authority and give it additional powers that are usually reserved for member states of the United Nations. Secondly, to state that the decision does not change the status of disputed areas. It does not confer any rights and does not detract from any rights of the state of Israel and the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And finally, to state that the decision will not form a basis for future negotiations and has no purpose in promoting a peaceful resolution to this conflict. Indeed, it simply seeks to perpetuate it. I hope that's clear. Next question, please.
Question from David Clement, the News Forum in Canada. There is a lot of debate over the Rafah border crossing, but has Israel asked Egypt to allow for civilians to cross the border to avoid getting caught in battle? If so, what has the response been from Egypt, and why isn't there more pressure on Egypt to allow for safe passage for civilians?
So thank you for that question about our border with Egypt. Look, first things first, it's important to reiterate that the peace treaty that Israel has with Egypt, Egypt is of course the largest Arab state in the Middle East. The peace treaty that we have with Egypt is extremely important to us. It forms the basis of a more peaceful, better future for all the nations and all the peoples in this region. And that's very, very important to the people of Israel and, of course, to the government of Israel. Directly to your question about opening up the Egyptian border, the border with Egypt, to Gazans, we have asked and it's been declined. The second part of your question was why hasn't more pressure been put on to Egypt? I think that's a question for other countries, not for the Israeli government. But I say again, these are sensitive negotiations. The relationship with Egypt and our southern border is extremely important. We know that Hamas are part of the Muslim Brotherhood coalition. They're part of Iran's axis of evil, of terrorism in this region, who are as much an enemy of the Egyptian government and people as they are an enemy to the people of Israel. Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Question from Joel Pollack, Breitbart News. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said today that the Rafah operation has had a, quote, negative impact, end quote, thus far. Could you respond?
Thank you for that question, Joel. Just to reiterate that our relationship with the US is extremely important to us. The US are, of course, our closest ally in the world. We have for decades been side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in our ongoing efforts to try and create a more peaceful future for not only the people of Israel, a secure people of Israel, but also for all the peoples in this region. So that relationship remains extremely paramount to us, and not least for all the support they've provided Israel over the last 7 months and the ongoing support. As to Secretary of State Blinken's comments, you mentioned negative impact. Yes, indeed, it has had a negative impact for the Hamas fighters and terrorists who are in Rafah, who the Israeli army have eliminated very skillfully and at great cost in our own soldiers. We lost our first soldier in this Rafah operation, which I announced earlier in our briefing. And we are, of course, going after the 4 battalions of Hamas inside Rafah. We will eliminate them, and we do that for the sole purpose of we cannot leave Hamas standing anywhere in Rafah. We don't say that we, or anywhere in Gaza for that matter, we don't say that we will eliminate every single member of Hamas. We will eliminate their structures. We are eliminating their fighting force. We are eliminating their ability to threaten us militarily and in any sort of way through their terror tactics. But we are shattering their organization. We've had tremendous success so far, tremendous success. But we always say that we want civilians to move out of harm's way. So that is our strategy. First thing we do is methodically, carefully, and sensitively, we let the locals know, Gazans know, not Hamas. We let them know through flyers, through emails, through phone calls in Arabic, through announcements on the media, through the internet. We let them know in every single way precisely where they need to move from and precisely where they need to move to. That has been our strategy. It has resulted in the lowest, we think the lowest ratio of combatant to civilian casualty figures, of which we are proud in the sense that we've killed more terrorists, but of course every civilian death is of course a tragedy. But if you want comment on the negative impact you mentioned, I think it's probably best to ask Secretary Blinken himself. That's not a question for me. Thank you. Next question, please.
Second question from Joel Polak. Both Blinken and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan have said that Israel needs a plan for, quote, the day after. Which one of the American models, Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan, would Israel regard as a model for, quote, the day after, end quote?
Thank you for that question, Joel. In recent days, the Prime Minister has been as specific as we can be about what will happen the day after Hamas. The first thing to say about that is, of course, it needs to be the day after Hamas. Hamas needs to be defeated. They are not defeated yet. We believe there are 4 battalions of Hamas still in Rafah. We believe that some of our hostages are in Rafah. So we're going after them. We're destroying the last parts of Hamas everywhere and other terrorist organizations in Rafah, but also everywhere else in Gaza. You know, of course, that they have a terror tunnel network twice the size of the London Underground. So it's hard work, but we're going through it methodically while, of course, keeping civilians out of harm's way. The Prime Minister has also laid out some of our thoughts and discussions that we've been having. Those are clear for all to see in the transcript of the interviews which the Prime Minister has very recently given at the end of last week and the beginning of this week. Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Question from Jim Williams, Zenger International News Service, Washington, D.C. David, good afternoon. This week, CENTCOM will replace EUCOM as the U.S. military team now working with the IDF. The move gives Israeli access to what is going on with countries in the region. Does the PM feel this is a plus for Israel's safety?
Thank you very much for that question, Jim. I haven't got anything more to add on that. That sounds like an operational question, which I recommend you put to the IDF directly to their spokesperson's office. Any other questions?
No further questions. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much for joining us today. We'll have another briefing for you tomorrow at the same time. In the meantime, please stay safe and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.